And you're all set.
Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining again and sticking with this. I know it's been pretty intense. And this is, I hope, our last intense one. We're covering a lot of time. We're covering 76, well, we're covering 100 years, really, 1776 to 1876. Not a lot of architecture happened between 1775 and 1800. For the reasons that we've talked about and that I'll just gloss over again today. But I will be going fast again. Think of it as a video, if nothing else. But the recording is nice to be able to, if you're really interested, to go back to something and look into something. So thank you again for hanging in there. And we'll get going. So today we're talking about the 19th century, which is 1800 to 1876 for the most part. It's a variety of styles, lots of adaptations, some revivals, especially later in the century, but we're still not talking about creative design. All of this architecture is repeating and expressing what's in style. And we don't have designers setting style like we do in the modern era, when architects and designers actually are much more creative than they would have been before. But that doesn't say advances weren't made all along, and they certainly were, especially in the 1800s. A really good question came up last week, and what I want to do next week actually is to hopefully just do an hour of a presentation and then have the rest of the time for questions and conversation and back and forth or whatever, just to be a little bit more participatory for all of you who might be interested. But just reiterating from what I had indicated when I in the way I answered the question, I was picturing, my mind went right to this building, which is a 3-decker from the 1960s. Right smack in the middle of the historic, well, not in the middle of the historic district, in the historic district. And it's one of the prompts that made the historic district be established, where this kind of interjection of modern style, new buildings, modern development, urban renewal, which was happening all over the place. Let's get with the program, let's get modern. That was a good mission in many ways. It just wasn't good for historic areas that had survived amazingly over 200 or 300 years, and Marblehead was one of those places that did. We all have heard of how much was lost in Newport, Rhode Island, although so much stayed. Or Boston, there's hardly anything from the 18th century. So Marblehead is very unique in that respect, and that's what we can appreciate. But absolutely, change over time happens because that's what human beings are. And in this talk, you'll be seeing this again, because everybody wants to modernize, and there are very few houses, none maybe, that stay static. Maybe the General John Glover House is one of the few that is pretty close to what it was. And even it has an awesome, beautiful federal period room from the early 1800s that is the period we're talking about today, but I'm not doing interior, so I'm not touching on that. But this is the streetscape as flanked by 2 historic buildings, this 3-decker house, which is actually pretty interesting. If I were to do an architecture website sometime, which is what I'm hoping to do, that would certainly be in it to represent the 1960s. So it stands important in its own right to represent a period of time, but it's kind of nicer if it's not smack in the historic district, especially if there were 10 or 20 or 30 all scattered all around. You would lose that sense of the historic sense that we do have in Marblehead. So in the 1700s, you had the 3 Georgian kings. The 1700s was pretty much the Georgian period. And you had these 3 kings that we talked about last week up until 1775, when the revolution actually, when hostilities broke out. It had been brewing, of course, in times that were very troubled for several years, and polarized, and social contention and political contention for almost 10 years before the war happened. But there is a queen, and that's Victoria, but not until 1837. So 1775 till she reigned, she gets a name of the Victorian era, which is a lot of the 19th century, because she reigned until I think it was 1901, starting in 1837. She was crowned as an 18-year-old teenage girl after a century and a quarter of men between Queen Anne and Queen Victoria. Most of them were old, and that's partially because George III, who was 23 in 1761, so a 30-year-old during our American Revolution, he grew into a very old age. He was 82 when he died, and he's the king who died mad, sadly, in 1820. So first period, we talked about the first period, the Georgian, and now we're going to be talking about the federal period and several afterwards. So the federal period is this quadrant that you see on the screen in this section. We'll also talk about Greek revival, which is the 1820s to 1850s, and the Gothic revival over on the left, and Victorian, which really covers a wide swath of architecture from really the 1830s, 40s to the 1890s or 1900. So I'm stopping today in 1876, which is the centennial of the United States, when our Declaration of Independence was signed. There's Abbott Hall, which represents that. I think it's so cool that Abbott Hall was built. Well, it was built in 1877. The cornerstone was laid in December 76. So we made it into 1776 centennial year. The Spirit of 76 painting is there, was commissioned for the 1876 Centennial Exposition. And I will talk about the building mostly tomorrow, I mean next week, but that's kind of the end of our session today. Here's another Abbott Hall, by the way. It's at the University at Buffalo, New York. That's the name of the university. And this is what Greek revival is. You'll be hearing my term. I'll be talking about Greek revival today a fair amount. And this is the high style version of Greek revival. But there's another Abbott Hall, which I thought was kind of fun. This is Marblehead's high style version of Greek revival. And I'll get into that more as we go along. This is on Pleasant Street in Marblehead. This is the typical classic example of Greek revival. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the 1820s to 50s, roughly. So the revolution really brought Marblehead's prosperity to a halt. A couple of years before that, it was problematic as well. That crucial privateering was essential to the war, but it was problematic for Marblehead for several reasons. And a lot of Marblehead seamen ended up sailing on Salem vessels, which benefited Salem. So just as in the 1600s, during the Revolution, Marblehead helped make Salem rich and wealthy. Marblehead had a good start on privateering, but the rest of the war, we really couldn't outfit the vessels. We didn't have the capital base, and Salem did. So a lot of Marblehead seamen sailed for Salem on Salem vessels. After the war ended in 1783, fishing resumed slowly. It was pull yourself up by your bootstraps, step by step, invest in shares and ships, get a crew together and outfitted. Over to Spain and down to the Caribbean again, but there were new markets. So we're out there on the fishing banks again in the North Atlantic. Rope walks are built. Those are long buildings for winding rope, and it's pretty fascinating. You can go to Mystic Seaport and see how that works. But a lot of rope walks were built down Atlantic Avenue. The buildings would have been very long, longer than this one, maybe 3 times as long, twice as long. Perpendicular to Atlantic Avenue, down that direction, if you can picture that. And warehouses and wharves were built and repaired and rebuilt. Schooners were invested in. A lot of people would purchase shares in ships rather than an entire vessel outright for a couple of reasons. That shared the wealth, and it also spread out the profits. So you had to work harder at making the profit, but you also spread out the risk so that you didn't lose everything. And it was a much smaller investment. So people had been doing that all along, except for the big ship owners, of course. But this is how they had to rebuild again, step by step by step. And you finally started to have ships coming and going from the wharves and the warehouses. This is a long wharf. Ours would have been short wharfs. But there were new trade opportunities, trade markets, especially in the European theater. The Baltic and the grain from the Baltic was a big cargo item. Boats were going to Archangel in Russia. They're used to, our guys are used to being up in the North Atlantic, so they're up there a lot. You still have all the routes to Spain. This is a cruise map, but it's also a good map to show us where some of the ports were that Marblehead vessels called at, into the Mediterranean and down to the Caribbean as well. We pretty much did not have the capital base to go to the Pacific like Salem did. Because of all that success in privateering, they could outfit those multi-year voyages. Marblehead's trade really was pretty much in the Atlantic and in Europe. So it was a problem, though, as the English and French got back into warring with each other. The war had never really ended. They were still warring and having battles in the 1780s, but especially in the 1790s, as after the French Revolution, into the later 90s. So Marblehead is in the crossfire. They're stuck in there. So the reason that's relevant is that unlike in Beverly and Salem and Portsmouth and Newburyport and Portsmouth and Hampshire, those communities were thriving and growing. Marblehead wasn't. Very few houses were built in Marblehead in the 1780s and 90s, especially in the 1780s. Those were the early years of the new United States. We're still recovering. I mentioned the privateering successes in Salem and also Beverly. Elias Heskett Derby, of course, made a killing in the privateering, very successful, and then he could outfit those voyages, but so did others as well. John Cabot in Beverly was one of them, and they could pay their crews and earn profits, and wealth generates wealth. So those Asian markets were open because America was the United States was an independent country, and they were free to trade wherever they could make the trade deals. And England and France were not as active in that theater in the Pacific because they were at war. So that's a whole nother story that we're not going to get into. This is the last Heskett Derby. If any of you want to go back to that a little bit, he had about 85 privateer vessels that employed 8,000 men during the war. That's pretty amazing. And their capture record is very, very high. So he raked it in. So did John Cabot, and this is where John Cabot lived in Beverly. And just as in Marblehead in the 1700s, Robert King Hooper and Jeremiah Lee were the biggest ship owners and the biggest employers in town. They employed many people in town, so that benefited their community. That was the same for Derby and Cabot in their communities as well. In fact, the Jeremiah Lee mansion, longer story than we have time to go into, but Jeremiah Lee's will was finally settled 10 years after his death. There had been a war going on, and extensions of trade are very complicated, and communication was complicated, and he died in 1775. So 1785, when his oldest son dies, his oldest son and heir, things can get wrapped up better. And it's pretty complicated how that works, but within a year, the house, the title to the house goes to John Cabot, a creditor of Jeremiah Lee's son-in-law, and the next year goes to another creditor up in Portsmouth. So John Cabot has a role in the Lee mansion briefly, even though Jeremiah Lee's wife, Martha, has dower rights to be in that house. It's a really gigantic house. It's really cold. She had grandchildren in Newport and in their old house. I suspect she might have lived in their old house during the war. It's hard to say, but this would have been a hard house to live in without a comfortable income. So when President George Washington detoured to Marblehead during his inaugural tour of New England in 1789, he wrote in his diary that well-known quote that the town had the appearance of antiquity. And that was because of all of that struggle that we had recovering from the war of those 15 years of war and 8 years of war. A few years after that, still, since between his visit and the beginning of the war. So it wasn't our fault, but the town was struggling. And I talked about the wars, why we were struggling, and why the fort was built in the 1790s. The fort was reinforced rather. It had been extended in the Revolution. It was reinforced significantly to what we see today in the 1790s and named after Samuel Sewall. So that's a repeat of what we had before. George Washington, when he visited, got was welcomed, of course, but the town also built an archway on the town common, which was up at Abbott Hall, very similar to the one in Salem. And a cameo wood carving of George Washington's profile was on that arch, just like it is in Salem. And here he is. That medallion, the wooden medallion, is in the collection of the Marblehead Museum, which is pretty cool. So the men and boys are still fishing. It's still dangerous. The children are still losing their fathers. The wives are still losing their husbands. Mothers are still losing their sons. It's very, very difficult. And the town still smells like fish. The fish are drying, but there's almost more fishing than there had been before, but it's just not as profitable compared to what it had been before the Revolution. We're still feeding the plantation workers, the enslaved plantation workers. That's still continuing into this new era. Slavery may be abolished by law in 1783, I think it was in Massachusetts, but it took some court cases to actually enforce that and to set precedent. It was not an easy road. It was also not easy to just become free after having been enslaved, but there also were continuing to be free Blacks in Marblehead and elsewhere. But all of our fishing trade is still based on, the bulk of it is still going down to the Caribbean. A lot of it goes to Europe, a lot of it goes to Spain, but more of it still goes to the Caribbean. So we are still in that world. Then in 1807 to 9 is an embargo. Thomas Jefferson, third president, closed the ports. Therefore, there was no trade. Everything came to a standstill again for Marblehead. Tensions were still running high. Once the embargo was dropped, the man who lived in my house in the early 1800s got tangled up in France. And his ship captured. So our ships are being captured. People are being thrown into the Navy or into, it's still a problem. And we're almost going to war with France still. So the gun house is built, then we almost go to war with England. And I guess this is more, the problem with France was more in the 1790s. The problem with England was more in the early 1800s. So our gun house was built on Elm Street around 1810. There it is. Just had doors renovated, but it's a nice brick gun house, 4 gun carriages to roll in and out. And it was built on Back Street, today Elm Street. But you can see where Back Street is in this J.O.J. Frost painting in the museum's collection. The cows and the pig and the calves being driven to market. Everybody kept a pig. There's a little cow down in the right-hand corner. So J.O.J. Frost paintings do start for the 19th century. They start to give you a sense of what the town felt like in the 19th century, even though he illustrated the colonial period quite frequently. But here you have up on Ferry Lane, which is, I forgot to look that one up, but it's pretty much becomes Pond Street. It follows around a little bit. The slaughterhouse and the glue works and the powder house there at the top left with a small arrow. The powder house that we've talked about last week, I'll show it again, but the glue works and the slaughterhouse, especially the glue works, were relevant to the next industry that Marblehead's going to do. So here's the powder house that was built in 1755. In 1811, the same year as the gun house was built, that's when Marblehead's favorite son, Justice Joseph Story, gets appointed to the United States Supreme Court, as opposed to Sewall, who was in the Massachusetts Supreme Court, Judge Sewall. So 1811, he was 32 years old. Probably most of you know that. But here's a portrait of him in the US Supreme Court collection. And I love this portrait of him in 1845, the year he died. I love that face. It's just such an awesome face. So he served, this Marblehead son served in the United States Supreme Court for many years, wrote much of US maritime law and in his early years there. As we were developing as a country, establishing our laws, wrote much of the Amistad slave ship case in 1839. And another Captain John Bailey is another person from this time period. He was the commander of Fort Sewell during the War of 1812. He had been on a privateer crew as a teenager in the Revolution. He was about 54 years old when he was commander of the fort in the War of 1812. This portrait is in the town of Marblehead's collection, probably painted around 1796 in southern France. And it was brought home to Marblehead, basically. It was rescued. It almost went to another collection, but Bob Booth had found it online and steered it to Marblehead. So it's now in the town of Marblehead collection, which is great. This is Fort Bailey, or located on Bailey's Head. That's Fountain Park, where a gun battery was one of several. If you heard the fort talk, you heard about those. It was called Fort Washington during the Revolution and afterward, but then it was Fort Bailey, and then it became Fountain Park after 1881 when James J.H. Gregory had bought the land and donated it to the town, which is great. Elbridge Gerry died in November 1814, the same year, just 3 months after the US Capitol and White House were burned by the British during the War of 1812. He was in the vice president's seat during the War of 1812. There's his grave marker, his memorial in the US Congressional Cemetery. He was too poor to be shipped home to his wife, and they were struggling because he, a longer story, he covered a loan of a relative and it went south. So he died very poor, and so did his wife. But here's a picture of the White House after it had been burned. So boy, these images resonate, don't they, in ways that we never thought they would. But there's his wife, who was left fairly impoverished with his children, with their children, no longer living in that fancy house in Cambridge. But Lieutenant John Glover Cowell died in 1813. He was on board the USS Essex. This portrait's in the Marblehead Museum collection. This is giving you a sense of the people who populated Marblehead and lived in the homes that we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes. You can read about Cowell, Lieutenant Cowell, wonderful portrait there. You can go see it when the Lee Mansion's open in the summertime. But his story and a bigger story is told in the book Mad for Glory by Robert Booth, and you can get a copy of it through him. Glover Broughton is also in a portrait in the Lee Mansion. He was part of this trade, the early European, the early 1800s, early 19th century trade to Europe. He was also imprisoned during the War of 1812 and drew the illustration of Dartmoor Prison that's in the Marblehead Museum collection and on view in the Lee Mansion. He then became our town clerk in the 1850s. Lovely portrait in the museum's collection. So these are the people who walked the streets and took care of the lighthouse. Ezekiel Darling was our first lighthouse keeper. The lighthouse was built in 1834. He didn't live in that house. That was a later house, but he kept the Marblehead light. And you can see the little connecting walkway to protect the lighthouse keeper as he walked from the house to the lighthouse, the residence to the lighthouse. He was a War of 1812 veteran, and you can read about him in Men of Iron, a book that I really, really recommend also. Mad for Glory is I recommend it highly, and Mad for Glory, Lauren McCormick was a co-author on that, along with Matt Brankel, and they did a lot of research on hundreds of men, really quite wonderful. Samuel Russell Trevitt, I have him in here because this is what people no longer look like. The clothing is a little bit different. These are some young men of Marblehead. We don't know who they are. They came down to the museum with the wrong attributions of who they are. Both of those men would have been age 62, in their 60s, when those beautiful miniature portraits were painted. So we're not sure who they really are, but they're beautiful miniatures in the museum's collection. But here are some of the guys from the early 1800s and 18 teens also, along with those others. And this is what a woman of the 1700s looked like, 1760s. This is what a woman from the early 1800s, 18 teens might have looked like. The waistline comes right up, very high. This is the shape of clothing and women's clothing in the 1700s. This is the shape of women's clothing in, again, in the 1700s. This is what it is in the early 1800s to the 18 teens. Long sleeves, short sleeves, very high-waisted, empire waist, as they call it. We're always following French pattern. And these terrific prints of the four seasons showing the garb of the early 1800s, especially spring and autumn there, with the women's gowns looking very Grecian. So we'll hear about that in just a minute when we get to the architecture. This Grecian look was all the rage. But then times change, of course, and by the 1830s, the silhouette is absolutely rounded out and much wider and much more substantial, and very low shoulders, as you can see, but very wide sleeves for these two women in the Marblehead Museum collection by William Thompson Bartall. They all have very interesting stories, but we don't have time to go into any of those really. But you can see where their hair is coming from. That's kind of a weird hairdo, and I think it works a little better with a tiara, but it really was inspired by Queen Victoria. Even though she's not wearing a tiara here, she often did. And here are some portraits for the 1830s and clothing from the 1830s and 40s. So it's much wider, much more three-dimensional, much fuller than the clothing was. Furniture does the same thing. Houses do the same thing. It keeps going back and forth. Slender, not so slender. That slender, then three-dimensional. Slender, then it morphs quite a bit. When we get into the 1840s to 50s, toward the end of our talk today, the people are looking a little bit more like this, with high necklines and kind of puffy sleeves, but definitely wider skirts and a crinoline under the skirts. This is the pioneer era, whether you're being a pioneer to Ohio or Kansas or even California, out on the prairie or wherever. These are the garb of those pioneers. And here are some of the famous people from that era, from the 1860s. Of course, Abraham Lincoln before his beard when he was a younger man. So that's how a younger man would have, a young adult man would have dressed, or an adult man. And Queen Victoria in matronly, darker clothing. So later on, we have, at the first session, I introduced the population information. I reiterate this here just so you kind of have a sense over the 1800s if you want to go back to it, of where Marblehead stood. But here's the map. We're still very small. We're still very concentrated. And it's, again, because of all of that hardship that the town did not just boom and explode like Salem did, and like Beverly and Portsmouth and Newburyport. So not very much different than the 1790s. Good comparisons there. But the recovery did finally begin in the 1830s. You can get that story in Bob Booth's book, The Women of Marblehead. And it started with women taking on piecework of shoemaking, soft shoe sewing, of the soft women's shoes. Women were good with needles. And this is how it started. It's kind of basically like microfinancing in the 1830s that benefited the community over time. The women really became very impactful in their communities, in their families, in their family resources, and in their communities, with churches, with temperance, with many different facets of their lives. So we crawled, we didn't jump, we crawled from about 5,000 in the middle of the 1700s, 1776, to 1830, still hovering around 5,000. Which is really pretty interesting. And then it got better. So here's Marblehead in 1839, once again, giving you a sense of the appearance as it was rendered in a woodblock in a magazine print. And men were doing shoemaking also in these little buildings called 10-footers from the 1800s to the 1830s. But it was when women got involved that it really kind of helped to benefit the community in different ways. And the men certainly benefited. The older men who were retired from the sea could hammer heavy soles to heavy leather uppers, nailing and pegging. The women worked with the soft leathers and the almost like fabric shoes. Here's the interior in the Marblehead Museum archives of a 10-footer cottage with the pot-bellied stove in the middle. That one looks like a really big room. The 10-footer cottages tended to be smaller. Here's an image of one, but there were many, many of these all over the North Shore communities. This is in Lynn, which was really the center of it all. And here's another one in Marblehead. That still survives. I believe that's a 10-footer. It might be a shed, but it might be a 10-footer. There's a 10-footer just up the road, right across from the Lee Mansion, just up Mason Street. So I unfortunately didn't have a photo of that, but you can go take a walk and find that. But this is the one, there's only one here at the bottom of Fountain Park. This is next to the end of that house with the coved cornice. But this will become a museum for Marblehead, kind of a stationary museum, look in the window kind of museum. So that's really terrific that we will have a representation in Marblehead of a very important industry. Also early in the 1800s, going back concurrently a little bit, 1804 was Marblehead's first bank, and it operated in the best building in town, which was the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. It had been held as collateral by those two absentee title holders. But in 1804, the founders, the trustees of the founders and trustees of the Marblehead Bank bought the building. The bank opened in 1804, and a spin-off bank when banking laws changed in the 1860s, 70s. In 1871, the Marblehead Savings Bank opened. That was a lending bank. The other was a banking bank. There were a difference in lending laws there. Then in 1831, as the recovery got going, a rival bank was established basically across the street from the Lee Mansion, built of stone, gray granite stone, to rival the older bank. And so the Lee Mansion was repainted and spiffed up and painted with a second sanded finish in gray to look like a stone building, solid, good place to keep your money and safe. And that became Bank Square, because then the Marblehead Savings Bank, when the Marblehead Museum bought the building, the Savings Bank moved over out of its corner office and banking room to this building right next door, practically to the Lee Mansion's kitchen. Outdoor kitchen, the summer kitchen. So that too this is a federal building, the federal neoclassical style that we'll talk about in just a minute, I promise. So getting to 1846, all of that, pretty much most of our fishing came to a halt. It had been going that way. The women were trying to get their men off the water, and in 1846, it actually happened very, very dramatically, that many of the men finally said, all right, we're staying off the water. Not completely, but this was a significant event that you can hear about on the Marblehead Museum's YouTube. There's a good program about that, but that's 1846, when so many people were lost, and a third of the fishing fleet were lost, and many orphans and children. Concurrently, that was when dory fishing was getting started. So Marblehead was not involved in dory fishing very much at all. It really started coming in the 1830s, 40s. I can't say much about it because this is an architecture class, but it's on our town seal. But Marblehead did, and it's up there in that WPA painting that you're seeing. But Marblehead was not involved in the dory fishing very much at all. That was mostly Gloucester, and that's partially because Gloucester filled in the vacuum, the emptiness that Marblehead left when so many men stopped fishing. And a lot of Gloucester folks were lost in that gale too, of course, but they brought in the immigrants. The Portuguese came in greater numbers and filled in the gap that Marblehead was leaving. And they did the dory fishing, which was so, so difficult. They meaning Gloucester. And it's still difficult fishing. So this building is really, I should back up. After 1846, the principal industry was the shoemaking industry. And I'm just going to blitz through like 2 minutes of pictures of some of the shoe factories and then we're going to start our architecture. But this gives you, again, the social context. This was one of the earliest factories at Water and Front Street. It was a warehouse from at least the 18 teens. I suspect it became a shoe factory in the 1840s or 50s. You can see that the building was modified. A third floor was added with a bank of windows for good light. So there were also distilleries in this area, in this part of town, and in other parts of town. There were about 6 distilleries in Marblehead in the early 1800s. Again, the soft women's shoes in the early 1800s, and then more sturdy shoes later on in the century. But Marblehead always specialized among the other types of shoes. It specialized in these women's and children's shoes. At first, houses were used as workshops, shoemaking businesses, just as coopers would operate in a workshop in or near your home, or incorporated next to or behind your home. Block makers, cabinet makers, their homes were very much a part of their businesses in the early 1800s and in the 1700s, but shoemaking went that direction also. Even in the 1700s, because there certainly were cordwainers, shoemakers in the 1700s. This is from the Marblehead Historical Commission's archives. I know Roger Tubison, an 8th grade teacher, is in the class, and the Marblehead Middle School had an 8th grade program that he and Jerry Orland ran, and the kids would do research on their houses. And this one is one of them, and they learned that there was a shoemaking operation in this house on Elm Street. There was a shoemaking operation in 19 Orange Street, 64 Orange Street, down by Beacon Street, down by the Lobster Company. So there were quite a few. And you can find a lot of shoemaking if you want to explore some of this in the Marblehead Historical Commission search. If you put in the word shoe, you get about 200 listings. If you put in shoe factory, you get a lot for the Marblehead Museum also. So you can explore a lot of this visually. But here are some of the buildings that I think were probably commercial buildings, maybe shoe factories, maybe other factory types of buildings on Washington Street, more so than apartments back then. They certainly are now, but they have commercial structure, especially that roof line on that red building. That's a kind of a commercial type of roof from the later 1800s. This is looking up the other direction now, and that's quite a little bay window and porch there that you don't normally see because you're watching the traffic as Washington narrows so much there. But here's another house that was a shoemaking factory, apparently, according to what Betty Hunt had found out. And there's again that industrial, commercial rather, kind of roof line and a nice big picture window later on. There it is again in a relatively small shoemaking factory on Hawk Street. So this is about the size that the factories would be in the 1840s and 50s. The 170 Washington Street, where the museum operates across from the Lee Mansion, that was a shoe factory. You can see it right there, the tallest building on the left. So that was, shoemaking was on site where the museum is, and that's a corner of the building that was in that spot in Washington Street across from the Lee Mansion. Women during the Civil War, 1,000 men and boys served in the Civil War, just like in the War of 1812, just like in the Revolution, a few more in the Revolution and then the Civil War also. But the women, these are women from the about 1910, but women started to learn them shoe machinery. And then of course, when the men came home from the Civil War, the women got displaced again. So that's a story that happens pretty frequently. But as the 1800s got going, especially during the Civil War and afterward, the shoe factories got larger, just as homes got larger. Here are some of the others from later on, don't know exactly when. But after these, the mansard roofs come in after the 1860s or 70s. But then the two fires happened in 1877 and 1888. 70 buildings burned, 3,000 out of work, then 50 dwellings actually and businesses burned, and more shoe factories with 2,000 out of work in 1888. So 3,000 people out of 6,000 is a lot of people out of work, if you really think about that. And you can do a screenshot of this if you want to and read it later, more than 70 buildings, 10 acres in 1877. And the fire broke out in a stable behind the Marblehead Hotel. And again, you can do a screenshot of that or go back to the program and look a little bit more in detail to those. But the factory's rebuilt, mansard roof again after the 1860s or 1877 fire. And here's a big one with a mansard roof that didn't actually burn, but it was torn down in 1894. But this is a building that burned in 1877. So the buildings got bigger. These buildings were in Marblehead. Hard to imagine. And this do a screenshot of, and you can look into that if you're interested or go back to it about the fires of 1888. And then here's another one. Not everything burned, not every factory burned, but most of them. This one was finally falling apart. And even in the 1920s, 19 teens, you still had a pair of factories that were quite large on Green Street. So, okay, so now we're going to do architecture. And this was the 18th century, the 1700s, which is based on classical architecture, still English in style. We're still English. The classical architecture is based on the architecture of Greece and Rome. That's what the word classical means. After the revolution, buildings get less horizontal and more vertical. It's a new version of classical, so we call it neoclassical. After 1776 is kind of when it took hold here in America, but then there was a war immediately. Jeremiah Lee Mansion is a precursor of it, but it really hits its full stride once the revolution is over in all of America, any of the places that were thriving, any of the communities and cities. So it's a new version of classical. We call it federal here in the United States after our new federal, which means centralized government. So that the two correspond to each other, the neoclassical style and our new federal government. So we call this federal architecture in America. While you had tall pointy roofs that became horizontal symmetrical structures in the 1700s, the tall post-medieval buildings from the 1600s morphing into the horizontal, symmetrical, balanced look of the 1700s, you now still had balance and symmetry, but you have a taller effect. And ideally, you have a nice porch, just like you did before. And we'll look at some of those a little more closely. But there are not too many of those nice porches in Marblehead, again, because our economy is struggling when you compare it to Newburyport and Salem. So they have loads of houses like this with these beautiful arch fan lights over the windows and beautiful porticos. But the point was tall and sort of symmetrical. 3 stories were the ideal, even if not completely symmetrical, and even if not fancy. And still, again, many of them housed 2 or 3 families. And some were shingle on the outside. Most were clapboard. Not all of them were large. These 2 buildings were built, these 2 houses on the right were built basically about the same time. So it didn't have to be tall, 3 stories. You could still build a small house. It's just those didn't last as long. And ideally, you got more bang for your buck in the 3-story house. So some of the ones in the early 1800s are very similar to the 1700s. I mentioned earlier that very few houses were built in the 1780s. I really don't know of any. But in the 1790s, there are a handful. This is one of them on Franklin Street. I forgot to put the street name on there. This one is on State Street. So there were a few. This is a home of a cabinet maker. Paint was starting to be more prevalent because it was more affordable, because the manufacturing of paint was cheaper after the revolution. Once we were our own country, we're allowed to manufacture. So people are starting to paint their houses more. And you didn't really see white until titanium dioxide was invented for paints about the 1840s. But the lighter colors were certainly very popular, and whitewash was a very common, a lime wash on your clapboards was a very common way to achieve the lighter federal look. white paint would have been a creamier color. But you still would have seen some houses, of course, that were not painted, whether they were built in the 1700s or the 1800s. But the houses built in the 1800s are going to be more inclined to have paint and look a little bit more like this. This is on Orange Street, and it was built as a 2-story house, probably 2.5 stories, gable or pitched roof, either one, but enlarged to 3 stories. Here's another one on Washington Street. And I'm not sure where my street signs went, because I know I spent a lot of time last night putting them in. But the 3 stories often housed many people. This is on Front Street. And sometimes they just built them hugging the rocks in Marblehead, on Washington Street, at Pearl Street. And you can, this is another view of that small house. And I'm not sure why I had that there. I guess it's to point out that not everything was symmetrical in every house. But so the Lee Mansion being the largest and a precursor of the federal period, I mentioned that Cabot had owned it earlier. You had a few precursors of the 3-story style of the best houses. This was a copy, really, I think, emulating the Lee Mansion around 1770 when it was enlarged. This is another 3-story house from the 1760s, Colonel Azar Orn's house. Robert Hooper's house, not King Hooper, the other Robert Hooper, another 3-story house. But you look at the portico, it's got this triangle out front, just like the Lee Mansion did, and the dental blocks across the top. It could be a federal period house, but that portico sets it apart as a 1700s, 18th century house. Same as this one with the other 3 stories. So I'm kind of showing you the pre-existing 3-story houses before the revolution of Jonathan Glover off Front Street. But here you have Glover's house, and in the early 1800s, a new house was plunked right down onto the garden. The garden was sold off. That was the front garden. It's right down by the town landing. And here you have another house built into the yard. This is happening over and over again because space is at a premium, of course, and it's a crowded town to begin with. But he happened to have a garden. Most people didn't. So here, your new look to the community is these taller houses. For porticos, the triangle that you saw in the colonial period, whether for a pitched roof or a gambrel roof, morphs into a combination of the new fan lights as glass is getting more affordable. But it still had a triangle in the early 1800s. And you see this kind of doorway portico quite a lot in Newport, not so much in Marblehead. This is one of the few that I can think of. It's on Middle Street. So it's a kind of a transitional doorway to what we'll see more going forward. But the ideal would have been a nice doorway portico that now is square or rectangular instead of triangular. So here are the 2 really good porticos from the federal period in Marblehead. On the left, you'll see the houses again, but on the right, it's the house you just saw on Pleasant Street. And on the left, it's a house on Washington Square. This house, this doorway, is a closer view of the doorway with the dental blocks, which are much smaller and more delicate than they had been in the previous, in the 1700s before the revolution. And the nice small fan light above the door, enough to get some light in, but still not that giant large fan light that was the ideal. So there's the house on Washington Square where that portico is. And I think next time I'll switch that slide around. So again, no longer do you have the triangle, but you have the rectangle. Otherwise, the houses are pretty similar. And there's the door again. I moved it and must have copied it instead of moved it, tried to move it. There are the windows. You've got the newer window panes. 6/6 is the typical window pane, 6/6 panes and the window sash of the early 1800s. And you see much more of that as we go through the 1800s, the 19th century. Here's another of one of the better houses, 3-story houses with a beautiful portico also that's a semicircle. You see quite a few of these in Salem. This is the only one in Marblehead. It's right across from Abbott Hall. There's a close-up of it. And you have window lights around the doorway that might have been added in the next generation, because that wasn't quite as much the style in the early 1800s, but it depends exactly when the house was built, etc. So it might have been built this way, or those window lights, the rectangular window lights or panes around the doorway might have been added later, but the portico is what really counts in this one. So beautiful views of that. And at the top of the roof of that particular house, there's what we call a monitor, or what is called a monitor. That's basically a ventilation system in the attic. It serves the same purpose as a cupola, like on the Lee Mansion, but it's called a monitor, and it's very rare, and you don't see them very often because they get eliminated. You can certainly update your colonial house with a federal period doorway and look much more in style. So that's what you see here on State Street. Both of these houses on State Street did exactly the same thing, added a federal period doorway to a colonial house. There's another view, another angle of that house. And there's that doorway. So that's some of the detailing that you can see. That's at State Street. It's right up from the town landing. It's a prominent space. It's a prominent place. It's one of the fancier door frames in town. Oops, there's another one on State Street also, I think. This is on State Street next to it, where this one got a larger fan light. Door might have been put in later, maybe 10 years later than the one in the blue house that we just saw. Or these people spent more money on their on their fan light window. It's hard to know. But that's very much a colonial style house. It was a very nice house. It used to have a rusticated facade. Right now it just has corner blocks. The rusticated facade was removed. Well, it actually wasn't removed, I guess. It was faced with clapboards over the rusticated facade. It was one of about 5 houses in Marblehead that had rusticated facades there on State Street. So then those are hard to maintain. It got clapboards, kept the corner blocks on the sides, but got a very nice updated doorway. Here are 2 more fan lights on Washington Street at Pearl Street, the Harbor Light Inn that you've seen before, the 2 buildings next to each other. There's a close-up of it. That's just a pilaster with a recessed door. A pilaster is a pillar that is attached to a wall as opposed to freestanding. So that portico looks the same from the front, but none of the last ones that we've seen here project into the sidewalk. This one is flush with the wall, but the doorway recedes to make it a nice little vestibule. So the first part built 1929, then the rest of the house 1819. 1819 is a year where there's a giant financial panic. So that was kind of a tough year too, economically. Beautiful doorway. Don't know if it's from the early 1800s or a later revival of the early 1800s, but this is one of the many houses that was a 2.5-story house built in 1754 in this case, moved backwards to have a nice front yard, maybe even in the early 1900s. That 3rd floor, I don't know when that 3rd floor was added, but all of that embellishment, the 3rd floor, and then maybe even also the portico doorway, if that wasn't added even later, maybe in a colonial revival period, which incorporated in the 20th century. Colonial revival referred to an appreciation of the colonial past, but they also appreciated the federal past, and both styles were merged together. There you can see the portico projecting outwards from that house that used to sit flush with the street, but then was moved back. Same enlargement happened with this house as we talked about before. Used to be a gambrel roof or a pitched roof, Elbridge Gerry's birthplace. Same thing happened with this house on Orange Street, originally a 2.5-story house. This house too had been a smaller version of the same thing. 1 room over 1 room became 2 rooms over 1 room, 1 over 1 over 1, where it used to be very similar to the house, the yellow house to the right of it. This 17th century house was enlarged to 3 stories at some point. So you see it happening a lot. And we talked about this last week, but if any of you didn't attend last week, there on the left, you can see probably where the original 18th century house was and the 19th century enlargement around it to the right and across the top. And there's apparently a shop down below it, a retail shop at some point, one way or the other, some kind of workshop or retail shop. Same thing happened here, possibly with the purple house, clearly with the yellow house. And again, but that beautiful doorway sets it off. Even if it's not symmetrical, it's got a beautiful federal doorway. And that's what counts. That's your focal point, is that doorway. This is another embellishment that's very unique in Marblehead. This is the only house I know of with this kind of cornice molding at the roof line. We talked about the scrolled modillions from the 1730s last week. Well, this is a beautiful kind of twirled rope molding behind these little delicate brackets. Beautiful house. Don't know when it was built, but it's a lovely house on Middle Street. There are the details of the molding, the cornice molding outside. It has beautiful cornice molding inside also, and an awesome staircase. This is the only curved staircase I know of in Marblehead. The better houses would have had this kind of staircase. Go to Charleston, South Carolina, you'll see a lot of them. But this house has it. It's very, very wonderful in this house on Middle Street. During this period, brick construction really started to proliferate in New England. Prior to that, people had been concerned about brick houses because of the fact that brick houses retained dampness in cold weather. Wooden houses breathed, as many of us know who live in wooden houses if they're old. But the heating systems were better by the 1800s, the early 1800s. Houses were beginning to be heated by stoves. And there were many, many fires. Fire in Newburyport, 1811, fire in Salem, fire in Boston. There were many, many fires, not in Marblehead, a few small ones, but no big ones. So more and more people are starting to build in brick. And we talked about this last week. This house has no horizontal lines. It's from the early 1800s. No horizontal lines, new trapezoid shapes above the windows. There's the doorway with that small fan light again. That's not going to ever get any bigger because it's all trapped in the brick there, but a beautiful fan light. There are the trapezoids above the windows, a shop window, formerly one big shop window, probably a bow window on the front originally. That's probably why both of these houses were built of brick, because their owners had invested in expensive retail goods. They wanted to protect their investment from fire and look substantial. So both of those houses would have had shop windows advertising their wares on Washington Street and Hooper Street, both very main streets. So there you see those horizontal lines again on the house on the left, built in the 1750s or 30s maybe. The house on the right does not have them. But there's the colonial version of brick. This is the federal version of brick when you're being built in the older style, perhaps by older masons in the 1790s. So they knew that the 3-story style was still fashionable as for any of the better houses, but they're still building the older style of the arched windows with the horizontal lines. But again, that nice federal doorway delineating, the lines delineating the horizontal nature, but the federal doorway stating its federal up-to-date style. No horizontal lines there. This is one of the nicest houses because of the portico in Marblehead that is brick. You saw it earlier, but the trapezoids have an additional detail on them in the middle. So that's just a little extra cost, a little extra fashion, the extra wide fan light. There's the doorway, a fan light over that projecting portico, and the window lintel. This house had the window lintels also. This is on Lower Washington Street. It's again a house that you might miss as a federal period house, but it's a 3-story. It has a portico that was updated in the 1870s or 80s. Who knows what it had to begin with, but it is a federal period house on Washington Street. Lower Washington. There are even incised lines in the detailing of the windows in this building, in this house. And the shutters are important to note, because I mentioned shutters last week. I mentioned that shutters pretty much proliferated after the Revolution, inspired by the Caribbean. These are Indian shutters. Paneled shutters inside the house are not Indian shutters, although that's what people call them now. These were Indian shutters, and they didn't mean they were protecting you from bows and arrows. They were protecting you from the hot Caribbean sun down in the West Indies. But they certainly, the principle applied in warmer climates all up and down the seaboard and into the inland as well. So shutters are a very functional feature of houses, but this is a real kind of shutter with the movable louvers that you could control the light and redirect the rain or whatever you needed while still having airflow in the house. Third floor didn't matter as much. So it was your children, it was your servants there. So maybe not movable shutters, but maybe they were. It just varied. But there's that later portico from the 1870s or 80s. We'll talk more about those next week. But they get applied onto houses. A Victorian doorway, also a door itself, the door itself. And this says it was the colonial home of Captain Ben Andrews, 1742 to 1821. So he's in his 20s in the 1960s, in the 1760s. This house couldn't have been built before the Revolution. So it's certainly not a colonial home, and a little more research probably needs to be done on that. But here's another small brick house, or another brick house, but small, the small version, the one room over one room version of brick. And this is on High Street. It was built in the 18-teens by a brick mason who built a lot of fireplaces and built himself a small house, 1812. Jason Chamberlain, he ended up buying the King Hooper Mansion in 1819. And thank goodness he did, because he was a mason and he could stabilize all of those massive chimneys that hold the house together. So that's a story for another time, maybe even next month, for the Marblehead Arts Association. But this is a nice house built by a brick mason up on High Street. Very small example of a brick house. Doesn't usually, you don't see those much. This is also, again, the same period where warehouses are being converted into dwellings because the trade is becoming a little bit less. This is 1802, as right on the, had been on the shore of Neck's Cove, which was later filled in. But that was a warehouse that became a house. So was this one, became a house in the 1820s. Has 1820s interiors. Here's another warehouse that eventually became the Driftwood Restaurant. And there's its Victorian front windows from the 1800s. So that's a surviving warehouse as well, as is this one, with a corner entrance and a very nice Federal period doorway. That's right opposite the town landing. So the construction of these houses is virtually the same. I won't go into it like I did last week, but they're still post and beam houses in New England for the most part. Balloon construction was thinner posts and studs, and it was so thin that people at first in the 1830s, 40s, when it was introduced, people were afraid the building was going to burst like a balloon because the wood was so thin. But it didn't for the most part, and it became much more regular. But the construction's pretty much the same for these houses, lath and plaster inside, post and beam structure-wise. The floor plans are similar, except those center chimneys tend to move. They don't have to be so big anymore. And they move to the side or they move to the back, but chimneys are rebuilt constantly because that's basically updating your heating system. Often there is a back section, but not necessarily all the way back. Sometimes it's just on one room of the house, but your chimney would move accordingly. No more of these multiple chimney flues, because now in the 1800s, chimneys are mainly to encase and protect stovepipes, because houses are, and there's an example of a very tall, narrow chimney in this double house up on Watson Street, because houses are now being heated by stoves, iron stoves. And you can see how the stovepipe the stove was freestanding. It raised up and curved in and vented into the wall above the fireplace. The fireplace was often like a frame for the stove, vented in through the wall and up through the chimney. But most of the chimneys, some of them were still the old chimneys, but a lot of them were relocated and moved. Lighting is changing at this time. Technology is changing dramatically, especially in the 1830s and 40s. It's like the 1990s with the technology for the software and computers and everything. The 1840s was a huge burst of technology. It's a very interesting time to study and talk about. But going back to the chimneys, this house was built, another one of those small houses from the early 1800s, built on what had been built about 1810, according to the date of the Babu's research, up on Cowell Street at Elm Street, which was the former location of a lime kiln in the 1700s. So your technology, your business industries are changing, and so are the building practices changing. So after the War of 1812 ended in 1815, a new, thoroughly and uniquely American style was adopted nationally. It's still symmetrical, but the houses became more temple-like in appearance. The house itself, or the building itself, the bank, the university, the business, the state office, the political building, the Supreme Court, the justice, the local courts. The 1820s or 50s, they became much more temple-like in their appearance. It was very much an American style, because after the War of 1812, Americans had, for the first time, a sense of themselves as a nation, not just a bunch of disparate states after having been a bunch of disparate colonies. Now we really, for the first time, we defeated England twice. We had almost like 2 wars of independence. We now felt like we really were a country. And then all the slavery mess started happening, and the politicizing and the polarizing, and it just became quite messy after that. But for a while in the 1820s, we saw ourselves as a country. Whereas Georgian incorporated elements of the Greek and Roman architecture, like keystones and cornice blocks and little mini temples of the porticos, just like you saw in the Lee Mansion or in the Old Townhouse. Now the entire building looked sort of like a Greek temple, the entire front facade of the structure itself. You see this a lot in the antebellum mansions. If you think of the pre-Civil War Southern plantations, this is very much a house that could have been in Louisiana. It's not huge like some of the big plantation houses, but many of those plantation houses had pillars. I'm trying not to show too much that's outside of Marblehead, just so that it's not confusing. I'm really trying to show just what's in Marblehead as much as I possibly can. But this is a very nice I can't remember the date on this house, and I didn't have a chance to drive by and check it out. It's one that's not in my head. Most of these are kind of in my head. But thank goodness for all those Bob Booth signs and so forth that tell us when the house was built, because I rely on that, and so do other people, to see them. But I think it's the 1820s, could be the 30s. It's a Hooper house. That's a prominent family. That was the house, the Hooper family that helped rebuild Marblehead after the Revolution. It's not the King Hooper family, it's the other Hooper family. You've seen their houses before also, the white one with black shutters. But this is the new Greek revival look, very flat facades, a new kind of portico, especially in the 1850s and 40s. This is one that is outside Marblehead. You could see a house like this very much in Vermont or New Hampshire or Maine or Ohio or Kentucky. Those are the areas that are being, the migration is growing. The Western movement is growing. This is the style that moves west and moves to Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, upstate New York. But we don't see it much in Marblehead. We see the older version or the more conservative, smaller version, just because our money isn't there in, like the big ones. But you would see these smaller ones in those same places as well. Ohio, a lot of westward movement and migration from New England to Ohio in the 1820s, and they took the architecture styles with them. Also Hawaii in the plantation era there. And in California in the gold rush. This is the 1854 former courthouse for Mariposa County in Mariposa, California. Mariposa County was the mother lode county. And this is the town itself of Mariposa is 1 mile long and 2 streets deep. And the courthouse and the schools are on the 3rd street. Jesse Street for Jesse Benton and the gold rush people. The Bentons were from Missouri, but there's a westward movement and they bring the architecture with them. And this little Sierra Mountain foothill town is where my sons grew up with their dad, and they summered here in Marblehead. So I would go to Mariposa and see this New England courthouse all the time as a soccer mom who came in on the debt. But you see this architecture only a little bit in Marblehead, more in other towns around us. Here's this is Washington Street, the extension below Five Corners, and on Mugford Street. But you see these very heavy eaves and the heavy triangle at the top of the building, very flat facade or a clapboard facade. The ideal was a flat facade looking like stone, clapboard on the sides there you see on the left, but very heavy frames around the doors now. They're not the delicate frames you saw in the federal period in the early 1800s. Everything's getting much heavier. And remember I showed you that clothing, how the clothing got much more three-dimensional. So did the houses. Here's a house on Harris Street with a very beautiful detailing on the corner post. These are plain, these corner posts. This one's detailed, but it has a clapboard facade, not a flat facade. So it depends on where you want to put your money. There's the bigger picture of that temple-like structure. The triangle across the top on Harris Street and elsewhere disappears in the 1830s or 40s, but the heavy eaves remain. And you have to finish them off somehow. So you get these heavy eave returns that you're seeing in the roof lines, and you will be seeing them over and over as these colonial 17 teens to 1750s, 60s, 1-over-1 room houses with a roof line that runs right along the tops of those second floor windows. The roof line gets raised up a little higher because the stoves are heating the rooms. You can have a taller ceiling. They sister the posts, they raise the ceiling at least on the second floors, and they reorient the roof line completely. And by the 1830s, a lot of these roofs are rotting out, the shingles and all that. So it's easy to take off the rafters and the purlins and reorient the roof line, and you have a modern house built on top of a 1700s house. Over and over again. Lee Street, Lookout Court. They, in this case, built the house as it was, and the doorway is on the side of the house. It's a wonderful Greek Revival doorway. Couldn't find my photo of it, but still those pitched roofs are limiting in those third floors. So shed dormers in the 20th century are often added to these third floors. Here's another example on Washington Street. That was a cabinet maker's workshop named Hawks Home and Workshop, built in the earlier style, enlarged and modified in the 1850s. And that's right where the Mary Alley Hospital was and where the first church was on Franklin Street, the second edifice of the first church. But here's a much bigger, more Victorian looking house that had the same modification that we talked about last week, where probably the door was on the left, probably the roof line ran across the top of the windows paralleling the street. And then the whole roof line was oriented in a much bigger structure, resulted with a center door, very symmetrical on the side of the house. But look at how much space there is above the windows there. Again, you're almost always going to see that in the houses that were built or modified in the 1800s, unless they were modified as a 3-story house. But I show you this house because of the doorway portico. It was enlarged earlier in the 1800s, but the doorway portico, this is a Greek Revival, heavy projecting portico. It's not the delicate dental blocks you would have seen in the federal period. It's not the triangle you would have seen in the colonial period, but it's a much heavier projecting doorway, just like you had heavy door surrounds. But on the right side, you've got a federal period doorway. It's maybe the older doorway, probably not the exact same woodwork, but probably left over from when the house was enlarged in the early 1800s. There you have that Greek Revival doorway again in Elbridge Gerry's house that was enlarged in the probably 1840s, judging by the portico. And there it is, very heavy lines compared to the delicate porticos from before. There's the Federal on the right, the Greek Revival on the left, and the Federal house versus the Greek Revival house. So here's another Greek Revival doorway portico, square columns, just like you saw in that bigger house, probably from the 1840s and 50s. So now by the 50s, they're starting to get a little lighter again. But a Federal house dressed up to be more modern in the 1840s or 50s. So as we move forward in time, there's the large expansive porch in the Hooper house that has flat flushboard paneling in the front. They call it the flat paneling with a full porch across the front. This one has another Greek Revival doorway, but it's a double house, double doorway there with colonial looking dormers, but it is a Greek Revival house. And you can see those posts on the side of the corner of the building, just like you saw in the house where I was talking about the temple structure. So the house is very much anchored in a heavier structure than it had been in the colonial period. It's a beautiful example of a house. It's the only example of a real good double door that we have built all of a piece at once from the Greek Revival period on Watson Street. Again, replicating this house that's not in Marblehead, the feeling of that house. But you had the small houses mingling with the larger houses. And I've got, my screen just stopped moving. There we go. Again, you're seeing this Greek Revival doorway in colonial houses all the time. Lipstick, now it's catching up with myself. Let me go back. Sorry about that. Again, like putting lipstick on the house to update it. And in this house, you're seeing the new style of windows. This is a gambrel roofed house on Washington Street. Somehow the photo's not on there in the smaller section, but you can see the windows have 2 panes of glass over one. So big Greek Revival doorway, but the window glass is pretty much from the 1850s or 60s, where bigger window panes of glass are available. This is the smaller 6/6 panes interjected into a bank of windows that are still right up against the roofline from a colonial period house. But the new windows and the new doorway give it a Greek Revival 1830s look. And indeed, the house does say that it was rebuilt later on, as early as 1810, but it probably got that doorway even later on in the 1830s or 40s. Here are the two houses on Wadden Court, showing a comparison of the colonial doorway versus the Greek Revival doorway with the window lights around it, window panes. Here's a house on Harris Street that is a wonderful Greek Revival doorway as well. That became the home, a home for poverty-stricken widows managed by the Marblehead Female Humane Society. At first, they helped provide for people quietly in their homes. They continued to do that, but they also, for a while, starting in the 1830s, I think it was, when this house was built, or maybe it started later, I'll have to reread the book. This was a home for women who needed lodging, but a beautiful Greek Revival doorway. More of the bigger, fancier 1840s, 50s doorways, again, compared to the smaller ones, but there's still Greek Revival on a colonial house over and over and over again, no matter how old that colonial house might have been. So these are again from the 1700s on Middle Street. But compare that to the bigger Victorian houses and compare the windows. Even though this house on the left has 1830s or 40s windows, the house on the right has the 1840s, 50s, 60s windows, and much bigger scale as you get into the second half of the Victorian, second half of the 1800s in the Victorian period. So colonial windows, colonial house with 1830s windows, colonial house with 1830s windows. I guess I didn't need to show that again, but you just see it over and over. I don't think there are any colonial windows left. If there are, they're reproductions. But again, you see that height above the windows on Washington Street and on Hooper Street. These are two houses that were built between the Lee and Hooper mansions. Lee on the corner on the right, Hooper in the picture. House is built in the 1840, and the house on the red house was a store. You can see there was a door, it had a store in it, in that one room or a workshop. You can see the threshold from the previous door that's no longer there. And this one was also a store from what I understand. And that explains the different kind of window fenestration. But the Greek Revival doorway from the 1840s or 50s, maybe even 60s, when perhaps it was no longer a store. You can get faked out though. This house had its roof line raised in the 1960s or 70s because they wanted to. So that doesn't count for a colonial house, even though the sign on the front says colonial, but it's no different than any of those others that changed their roof lines. This one didn't change the roof line, it just changed the roof height. And it was later. The early 1800s is also when you start to see vestibules, which were a practical feature of doorways to protect you from the elements as you took your wet coats off to walk into your house. There's another one on, that one's missing. Another one on West Shore Drive, a colonial period house or early period house with a vestibule added later on in the 1800s, sometime in the 1800s. That would have been way out of town, of course, at that time. Then by the time you get to the 1840s and 50s, you start to see a new doorway frame. And you can see it on this house in Circle Street. It's a little bit of a modified temple look, but no longer do you have the bold horizontal, but you have a slight pitch to the lintel over the doorway portico. This house is on Circle Street. It's number 19, which is a clever way to do that. But it was the house where Skipper Ireson lived. And you can learn about his story with the John Greenleaf Whittier poem. You can Google him. He was falsely maligned by his crew, tarred and feathered by the women of Marblehead in the earlier part of the 1800s. Excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat here. I go back to that, sorry, the painting is in the Albany Institute. I forgot to put the credit on that. And I'm not showing Skipper Ireson because he kept his dignity through this experience. And in the painting, he does not have his dignity. So I just chopped him out. There's that doorway on the house on Prospect Street that I said had been lived in by by Captain Samuel Tucker, colonial period house, updated doorway, Greek Revival with that pediment, but so not a horizontal, but a pitched pediment, still with the dental blocks from its previous incarnation. And here's a doorway on Washington Street, identical doorways, absolutely identical, except the door itself. But the doorways, the molding around that on Prospect Street and on Washington Street are exactly the same. So there it is. You see the doorway on Beacon Street on a 1790s house that got an updated doorway and bay windows, updated doorway in the 1740s or 50s, bay windows in the 1770s or, excuse me, 1840s or 50s doorway, 1790s house, 1880s or 70s bay windows on the side. So you can update your house in a number of ways. This is on Beacon Street, and they probably added that doorway because they were getting a lot of development across the street in the 1840s. Oh, I put that one in the wrong place again, sorry. Front Street, you just have that same doorway. That should have been before that slide. how many times do you go over this and you see that and still don't fix it? I mean, you go through your slides and they seem to make sense, but even when you do it large like this. So my apologies. Bowden Street was developed extensively in the 1840s. Here are some of the houses that are, as you can see, 1.5 stories was a very common development in the 1840s and 50s. It was a very inexpensive way to build. You see that slight pitch over the windows again that I talked about earlier, but 1.5 stories, and then an enlargement in the second floor later. Detail. This is Bowden Street again. This is the corner of Bowden Street with that doorway. So these areas were developed as the shoemaking factory district was developing. And it's remarkable that they did not burn in the fires because the fires were right adjacent to them. So now this is where I was supposed to have that Beacon Street slide. This is where on the ocean side, on the cove side, the water side of Beacon Street, quite a few houses were built in the 1840s. So I'm figuring that area might have silted in and solidified more than it had been earlier. Maybe it was marshier earlier. It had been a shipbuilding area early on in the 1600s, but gradually it probably silted in, and now it was solid by the 1840s or 50s. It was solid enough to build structures, dwellings on it. But again, 1.5 stories, and there's the waterfront area where these houses were built. Quite a few of them there. There are about 6 of them there. And here's one that's set back a little bit farther. So maybe the cove, who knows, maybe how the property line went, I don't know, but it's a smaller house, but of the same 1.5 story type of house. Here's the same kind of version on Orange Street with dormer windows to help out. Those dormer windows might be 1840s, contiguous with the house's construction. There it is, just a different color, but again, it was, you can see that there was a little bit of a shop of some sort underneath it, workshop or small retail shop. You see that a lot, but I show this also in comparison to the house next to it, which was a colonial period house, 1700s house, very different look. Here's Green Street, 1.5 stories with a dormer across the front. And also in the 1840s, you had what's called Gothic revival. And these little peaked gables come back from that 1600s era, but they tend to come back in 3s, ideally, or just one in the center. And they continue from the 1840s into the 1860s, 70s, maybe into the 80s. But they were kind of inspired by Queen Victoria's push to look back at England's heritage, the Gothic revival, and castles were built in the old Gothic styles, or houses were built with Gothic features. If you look at just the left side of the house, not the addition on the right, there's the Gothic 3 windows with projecting eave, and the eave returns on the gable side, on the side of the house which faces the street, and then the 3 gables on the side of the house, which is the facade of the house. That's on Village Street. This is Elm Street. There are 3 gables there. Also, this is a very quirky house. It's an 18th century house with a gambrel roof, but only half the gambrel roof, so not quite sure what's going on there. But it got an Gothic revival update that's very hard to photograph because of the trees. But if you take a walk on Elm Street, you can kind of peer under the trees and see that. But here it is, Guernsey at Linden Street as well, the series of 3, but also a little Gothic window with a little Gothic fan light, pointed window at the top. Another house on Green Street with the peaked gables, this time just 2, but a nice porch, 1850s, but still in the Gothic revival feeling. But porches really become a thing in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. Houses become more asymmetrical. You get a lot of L-shaped floor plans with an L and a porch that gives you a little bit of shade in the hotter seasons. Nice detailing on that corner post. So a Greek revival house, but with the L, it's not so much a temple anymore. It's more of a Victorian house and a Victorian era porch. Oops. This one has all the bells and whistles. This is on Beacon Street. It's the L-shaped floor plan with some dormer windows and a bay window, two different types of bay window, a porch with colonial revival balusters instead of the square Greek revival balusters. So a lot going on in that house, but that's typical of the Victorian period where a lot is going on. Here's one on Pond Street, a lot simpler, 1.5 stories, 2/2 window panes and a bay window. So probably added in the 1870s to an 1840s or 50s house. Here's a fancier bay window with a turret, probably getting later into the 1870s or 80s, but potentially still in 60s, which is in our time frame. And a projecting bay, which is very functional, but really kind of doesn't quite work visually and style-wise on that federal period house. There's the pitched windows again and the heavy eaves on a house on Elm Street, but I'm showing you this here because of the doorway, where they updated their doorway in the 1860s or 70s. And that's very much a Victorian doorway of the 1860s. So the house is from the 1840s, but the woodwork around that doorway and the doors themselves are 1860s or 70s. There's the view again overall, but it's probably because his next door neighbor built a very fancy Victorian house that we'll be talking about this style more next week. This is built in the early 1870s, so it's still part of our period, but we're starting to transition into a more elaborate Victorian period as we're at the end of our time period, with machine-made details that you could ship by train to any community. They were mass-produced, so they were affordable, and they could be very intricate, and people loved them, and you see them all over town in lots of different ways and patterns, because you could choose them. Your woodworker, your housewright would have access to them and could advise you on them, and you could choose. So again, early 1870s here with these details, so it's still in our time period. Another example of a doorway. And this is down on Washington Street on two houses from the early 1700s, which got doorways updated, very small doorways still, updated in the 1860s or 70s. There's the detail on that, with the lozenges and the channeling. And then more in the 1860s or 70s, maybe even in the 1850s, you get a style called Italianate that has an Italianate feeling of the Italian villas. Again, those woodwork details readily available. But the porch tells me this, and the small scale tells me this is probably 1850s rather than into the 1860s or 70s, but it's hard to know. Basically, the Victorian houses could be very basic, but larger scale in the 1850s and 40s, 50s, and 60s. So you can have detail or not. This has just a very beautiful Greek revival doorway with window lights built in the 1850s. So toward the middle of the 1800s, toward the end of our period today, we're getting bigger houses generally. That's the second Amazon truck that's backed up in this session on Washington Street, to round out our session today, as houses got ever bigger as the Victorian age wore on, just as clothing got wider and the sleeves 1850s to 1860s, the crinolines got wider 1850s to 1860s, ending with Abbott Hall in the 1876 construction, finished in 1877, 78. So that's the end for today, and we can go to some questions if you want. And I have to try and figure out how to get here I am, my view. So I thought I'd allow a little more time for questions today. for anybody who's still hanging in there and would like to know more. If anybody wants to unmute, go ahead.
How many Italianate houses do we have in Marblehead, like the one you're showing now?
Not very many. I'm going to try and show you a few more tomorrow because it's very much in character with the 1870s, 60s and 70s. 1860s, of course, was the Civil War. So again, not a lot of building is going on. They're introduced in the 1850s. They really thrive, these Italianate houses in the 1860s, 1870s. I would wager about 10, and we'll look at more next week, because they're kind of out of character with what we were dealing with today. And I didn't want to get to one more complicated complicated mass of types of houses. I thought the 1800s is so filled with change that I thought this was enough. But yeah, about 10 or a dozen. A lot of them up around Prospect Street area. So I'll talk about that next week.
So I asked that question last week about newer McMansions, and I guess today you talked about using federal period doorways quite a bit on colonial homes. So nowadays you see that there's been a resurgence of Victorian style doors, the ovals, but instead of leaded glass or clear glass, they have basically a reproduction, either glass or plastic, and no lead, some other type of material. And in windows, there's been a use of prairie style kind of snap-in mountains on what are casement windows, so that type of thing. So that really doesn't differ then from what you're showing us today, or does it?
No, it really doesn't. And I left out a really important part and reason for that proliferation of the Greek Revival doorways. Let's just get back to one for a second. There we go. The Greek Revival doorways that get put onto so many houses. I think you're talking in the hundreds for Greek Revival doorways. I left out a key point as I was running at the mouth there. The window lights. The window lights were what really made Greek Revival doorways so popular. Houses were dark early on. Some, in the 1600s, sometimes they had no glass. They had a wooden shutter, which was either open and cold or closed and smoky in the house. Oh, forgot to take the phone off the hook. Sorry about that. Let me just get that quiet. I took the phone off the hook both times, the first two, forgot this time. So houses were dark. In the 1700s, it got better. Windows got better. You had rectangular window panes, a lot of them, 9/12, whatever that is, sometimes 9/9. Then in the 1830s, why so many people liked these 6/6 window panes is because larger window panes and thinner muntins let in more light. The window cavity might actually be a little larger also. But when you go to the doorways in the 1830s, and you can afford to put glass window panes in your doorway, that was usually where your staircase was. Either still your tight winder from the old house or a run of stairs, but lighting was very problematic, even in the early 1800s. And if you could use sunlight to light your rooms, that was gold. It was cheap, it was inexpensive, and it was safe. The new lighting fixtures were physically very dangerous. Camphene lamps were well, you've heard of kerosene lamps. That was a flammable material that could burn, and you could be burned. Camphene was even worse. Camphene could sort of explode in your face. And these light containers, lamp containers for the oils, were often glass. So there was physical damage inflicted when accidents happened. Whale oil was better, but it was expensive. Other chemicals, other oils were smoky. So if you could have window glass, that was gold. So the larger the pane, the better. And if you could have window glass around your doorway and light that staircase, it was much safer for your family. That's why so many of those proliferated. And as you're looking at this house, of course, you're seeing the Victorian 2/2 window panes, 4 panes in each window, which made it even brighter than 6/6. So that's the proliferation of the Greek Revival doorways. The Victorian glass was, in the Victorian period, the glass was better manufacturing. You could make bigger panels of glass, and you see that even more so when you get into the 1870s. And so now we're just having revivals of a lot of that style, and revivals happen. I will, next week, I will have a handout of the different revivals. I didn't want to overload this week, but I have a whole page, of, you got handouts at the beginning that show different time periods. There's almost a whole page of revival styles for the 1800s. So there's an awful lot going on in the 1800s. So a lot to bring out now and be creative with, in addition to the modern styles. And think about modern houses, the modernist houses. There are a lot of glass in those houses. The glass walled houses in particular. It's all about light and bringing the outdoors in. Good question.
Judy, we taught our students, this is Roger Tuvison, we taught our students on the fanlight windows that were over the doorways. And we always tossed in that Ben Franklin at the Constitutional Convention said, "It is a rising, not a setting sun." Is that something that Marblehead is perhaps? I didn't see many in the examples you showed.
Marblehead does not have many fanlight windows because our economics could not rise to that proliferation level, that level of proliferation. Go to Newburyport or Salem to see that. Those towns were thriving, and they had 2 big fires that burned down a lot of the old buildings, not all of them, because they have a lot of really good 18th century buildings in both towns, vernacular, ordinary houses. But the newly developed areas or the burned areas had a lot of new development, and the fan lights proliferated there in both towns. Then Salem, of course, had another fire in 1914, but it didn't hit the federal period location. I've not heard that term for the fan light, so maybe I'm sleeping under a rock for that one, but I've never heard that. But Marblehead just didn't have the economic base to have a lot of that, but it had some, clearly. And I forgot to mention one thing, Roger, you had asked about earlier, and that was foundations. And I hope that you in particular were watching. I'm trying to get back. Well, here's one. Stone foundations. This foundation that you're seeing on this 1870s house is not that much different than the stone foundations you might have seen on an 1820s house from 50 years before. It's also not that much different than you would have seen in the 1700s. Marblehead had a lot of stone, we all know that. And the stone was hewn away by hand, and it was rubble stone. So as opposed to the National Grand Bank's cut granite, or the Lee Mansion's foundation of cut granite, that was really unusual. The stonemasons didn't come to America as much as they did, as much as other crafts did, because Americans just weren't building in the 1700s, just were not building those giant houses, as there wasn't enough work to entice a stonemason to come here. And therefore, the stone cutting industry in Vermont and Rockport didn't develop as early. The stone cutting industry developed, and I should have mentioned that when I showed the National Grand Bank, because it was an important point. The stone cutting industry developed in the 1820s and was thriving by the late 1820s into the 1830s. Thus, the National Grand Bank could be built of granite. Now, the Lee Mansion's granite foundation is from granite, probably from Braintree, because there were quarries in Braintree in the 1700s. The sandstone steps might have been from Connecticut or from Braintree. There was some sandstone in Braintree, but a lot more in Connecticut. So it's probably cheaper in Connecticut to get it in Connecticut. But hard to say. Those red sandstone steps, though, wash away really easily. Granite obviously does not. But most of Marblehead is built on stone foundations. And that's why rubble stone foundations, that's why so many houses from the 18th century, from the 1700s, do survive. And from the 1800s also, there was no fire, no major fire, and there was no, and they were built on stone foundations. The 1600s houses don't survive because they were not built on stone foundations. And the fire, of course, that happened was in a different part of town than the downtown. The big fires, the two big fires in 1877 and 88, those were in the shoemaking district along Pleasant Street mainly, not in the historic downtown. And some of you, I'm sure a lot of you know or have heard that in the early 1900s, the downtown area was really derelict. I showed you an image of one of the houses in the first two programs of what a lot of the houses looked like back then. So paint gets cheaper after the revolution. People start painting their floorboards inside their houses. They start painting their houses more as the 1800s develops. Certainly their doorways and window frames after the revolution. Paint is cheaper, glass is cheaper. You start to see it reflected in the buildings. What else? Enough? Enough for one morning? I think we've got about 15 more minutes for anybody else who wants.
House that you're illustrating right now on Elm Street,
Pardon?
it just caught my eye that the second floor windows are, what's the term? Are arched or?
They're arched or curved. Yep. I didn't touch on that a lot just because I was trying not to say too much. I know there's so much to talk about. And I was going to talk more about the windows that you're seeing on this house in next week's session, because it's very much more the eclectic Victorian time period. But yes, mass production, mass manufacturing, industrialization, you start to see mass produced products that are more affordable, more technologically able to be made. Certainly the Lee Mansion has a beautiful arched window in its up above on its landing of its staircase. It is 15 feet tall, if I remember. How many feet across? 6 feet across. The window panes for the Lee Mansion are 9 by 12 inches. That's huge for that period of time. It was mostly crown glass, so that was really expensive. And Jeremiah Lee, when he was building that house and the finishes, the frame went up in 1766. A roof was on it at the end of, September, October of 1766. The interior finishes went in 1767. That could have meant the glazing and certainly the windows might have been intact already in 1766 because the interiors were being finished. The woodwork was going in 1867. The mahogany went in the spring of 1867. That window glass would have been very expensive. And he had 18 rooms to paint. He had a lot of window glass. What were the taxes in the new taxes in 1767 were the Townshend Acts. And that was a reaction because nobody wanted taxes on their tea. Smuggling tea was big business. So England and that whole tea tax is a whole complicated issue. We've simplified it, but it's much more complicated than it seems. And it had to do with the trade corporations in England. But we Americans used it as our rallying point. But in 1767, the taxes were on paint and glass. the luxury items that Jeremiah Lee was spending a whole lot of money on at that time. So he might have been paying through the nose on all of that to build that Lee mansion. But you see the arches come back in the 1850s, 60s, especially 70s. Not many arches in Marblehead before that. So I think maybe you guys just get out early. We'll ring the class bell early and go have some early lunch or take a break and go on to the rest of your day. But I thank you for your interest and thank you for sticking with it for this intensive, concentrated course. Glad for your interest.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna
Thank you.
sign off. I think there's a way that I can do that.
Thank you.
Told me how to do that. Jenny, thank you. Good to hear from you. So I'm gonna leave the meeting now. That means it's gonna have all of you leave the meeting as well. So thanks again. Where did my control panel go? I've never controlled Zoom before. There I go. Okay.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to meet you.
You're very
Bye-bye.
nice. Bye-bye.
Where's the OR?
What?
Where's the OR?
You can do it right there.
In my chair?
Yeah. I have to see what I've got.
I have a couple of bags of stuff, miscellaneous. I'm not even sure what it is. Your right hand is, in my cabinet. I wish it was right along the edge. I mean, I may be useful stuff, but it is. There's a little tape in there too, isn't there? Tape. I haven't been cabinet. Another bag. Stuff for like, oh, they never use it. You sure?
Yep.
You sure?
Yep.